Hello. We continue to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the things that we've highlighted thus far is that the COVID-19 pandemic has both exacerbated and highlighted existing inequities in society. For example, according to a CDC report, COVID-19 case and hospitalization rates were 2.5 to 4.5 times higher for Black, Hispanic, and Native American populations than for white Americans. And in addition to these inequities in terms of the disease, we've also seen changes in how everyone is thought about and engaged with work. For example, we've seen in August of 2021, 4.3 million Americans quit their jobs in what has been called the Great Resignation. So today on Leadership for Society, Reimagining Work Post-COVID, I want to talk to Darren Walker about how we think about work and how we think about the inequities that are driving our society into. So it's really great to have you, Darren. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks for the invitation, Brian.
So let me just jump right in. So first, Darren is the president of the Ford Foundation, a $16 billion international social justice philanthropic organization. So as you think about your work, can you tell us a little bit about what the Ford Foundation is focused on and other things of interest to you at the moment?
Well, thank you, Brian. I'm really happy to be here. The Ford Foundation was founded by Henry Ford and his son, Edsel Ford, in 1936. Henry's grandson, Henry Ford II, brought the foundation to New York City after the foundation received the proceeds of what had been the largest public offering of Ford Motor Company in 1951. And so the foundation in the 1960s engaged in many facets of American life and international development. And today, we are focused primarily on the challenge of inequality in the world, inequality in all of its forms. Specifically, we are called to focus on inequality because our mission, in part, as established by Henry Ford II, was to strengthen democracy and democratic institutions in the United States and around the world. If democracy is to be strong and vibrant, inequality has to be addressed because inequality does something to democracy. Because a democracy like America is built on and foundational is the idea of hope. Hope is the oxygen of democracy, and inequality asphyxiates hope. And so if we want the mission of the foundation, that being advancing a strong democracy in the United States and around the world, then we have to address the issue that is among the greatest threats to that democracy. And so that is why we're focused singularly on the challenge of inequality.
And so I'm happy you brought that up. So I'm curious, how do you think about philanthropic activity and capitalism? So you talk a lot about democracy and inequities and how those inequities kind of smother democracy or the hope of democracy. How do you think about capitalism? What are the inherent costs of capitalism, and how does philanthropic efforts engage with capitalism?
Well, let's first understand we are capitalists at the Ford Foundation. I believe personally that there is no better way to organize an economic system than capitalism. But I also, if I am to be really sobered by the challenge of inequality, I have to acknowledge that we have some real problems with the way capitalism is being experienced by many people in this country. And if we just want to focus on our country, capitalism is not delivering shared prosperity. Capitalism and democracy are always in this dialectic. There is always tension. And my view is that democracy must win. Capitalism is important, but if capitalism undermines our democracy, then we've got a problem in America. And so for me, capitalism and policy deliver the shared prosperity idea. We've got to have capitalism that is within a system of democratic policy making to ensure that the populace, the citizenry, actually believe that the economic system is delivering for them hope,
Mm,
delivering for them some sense of fairness, a sense that, particularly if you are working class or poor, if you have been parts of marginalized and historically excluded populations of Americans, that this system uh, today is not compounding the historic inequities in our system, and is indeed unleashing opportunity for all.
hmm. And you mentioned the tensions between the dialectic between capitalism and democracy. What do you see as the primary tensions between the two?
Well, the primary tensions manifest in the way in which our economic system, particular sectors and industries, uh, serve or support or undermine. So let's just look at journalism.
Mm,
Our founding fathers believed that America would be best served by an informed citizenry. This is why in the 1960s, the Ford Foundation helped to create the Corporation for Public Broadcasting,
mm,
public media. Today, we have a media ecosystem that is driven uh, to deliver the highest returns, not deliver the best quality journalism. And so, this is an example of something I worry about, that if our democracy depends on quality journalism, but the capitalist system that we believe in doesn't reward quality journalism. In fact, rewards uh, very poor quality journalism, rewards the most pernicious kinds of information flow, indeed, rewards disinformation and misinformation, that actually that kind of media gets a better return, and therefore investors will invest more in that kind of media rather than the kind of media that serves the citizenry, serves our democracy. Then we've got a problem. We've got a problem if we have a technology sector that is highly unregulated, that uh, has basically, as a private sector, determined what the public interest is. There has not been yet a clear uh, articulation of, in this new uh, internet world, in this new digital era, what is the public interest in this new era, this new field, this new sector, this new technology? Because there is tension between private interest and public interest. And democracy is a mediator of that tension. And so what I worry about is that we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the talent in government, for example, to ensure that the public interest is represented.
Because it's you mentioned that you think if there's a tension between capitalism and democracy, democracy needs to win. And part of what I hear you saying right now is currently capitalism is winning in that tension. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fair to say that in some spheres, it's clear that capitalism is winning. And as a capitalist, I want capitalism to succeed in America. But in order for capitalism to succeed in America, we need reform. We need to understand why it's not delivering for working class people in rural America. We need to understand, again, in the technology, using the same example, why is it we have so many households in rural America and in urban America not connected to the internet? I mean, and so this is One of the things that was revealed to us during COVID, the conversations around uh, education and particularly young people's learning and being left behind because school was out and they only had the option of, uh, of digital learning. Well, how do you have digital learning when your family can't afford the connection to the internet? And so we then see the visuals of children in urban America uh, sitting outside of McDonald's and Starbucks so that they can get connectivity to do their homework. That's not the America uh, I believe in. That's not the America I aspire to live in. I aspire to live in an America where everyone has a right to the internet because it is indeed the highway of opportunity in the 21st century, and everyone should have equal access to that highway. We have not figured out a way for that to happen in America. And until we do, our democracy will be disserved.
Hmm. And who should be responsible for addressing these issues? Like, what actors in the system do you think, for example, in terms of the access to the internet, right? There's private industry, there's government, there's philanthropic efforts. Like, how do you see the vision of responsibility for addressing these issues?
Well, let's be clear, philanthropy can't solve this specific issue.
Hmm.
There isn't enough charitable dollars, and nor should charitable dollars be used extensively to solve for what is a public policy and a market failure. And so the public sector and the private sector must come together uh, to uh, to actually navigate a solution here. And there are certainly in the pending legislation in Washington some efforts to address this condition, but it's not systemic. It is not permanent. And that's what we need. And so this is, Brian, when I talk about that dialectic, this is the tension. When you
Hmm.
talk to the telecom companies, they will say, um, this is what it costs. And when you talk to the government, they say, well, we can't afford uh, the per household um, fee that the telecom companies have. If we were to do that for every household in America, that's just not possible. Or every low income household in America, that's not possible. It has to be possible. We have to figure out a solution to this, or we will only compound because the very people who are being left behind are the people who were left behind in uh, the electrification of America almost 100 years ago.
Hmm.
And this was why we had the Rural Electrification Act to
Hmm.
address the fact that we were getting households across America, certainly across our cities and suburban areas, were getting basic electricity, but rural Americans were not. So we came up with a solution for that. We need to have that level of urgency and ambition today for the internet because it is indeed the corollary to
Hmm.
electrification.
So it sounds like you're talking a little bit like stakeholder capitalism, where everyone in society has some interest in the way the society functions, which is obviously true. But right now, the balance of power doesn't function that way. Like, how do you shift from where we are right now, where big corporations have an inordinate amount of power, and the kind of the people you're talking about, the people who were originally skipped over in electrification, and the people who now don't have access to the internet? How do you shift the balance of power or change the perceptions of interest so that those issues are addressed?
Well, there's no doubt that this is among the most vexing challenges in America today. And this fundamental issue of power, who has it, who doesn't, is playing out in many facets of our lives as Americans. There is no doubt that we need leadership. We need leadership in every sector to have the courage to step forward and really solve these problems. There is no doubt, I believe, that stakeholder capitalism must be our future. I believe that uh, the harm that was done by those 50 years ago, I'll just name one of the icons, Milton Friedman, who I think at the time wrote some provocative and I think in some ways necessary uh, ideas of addressing the need to recalibrate the level of regulation and taxation and how the role of the enterprise was being understood, some 50 plus years ago. But I think, unfortunately, even many Friedman acolytes will agree that much of what he wrote was perverted and hijacked in ways that have generated the kinds of inequality we see today. And you sort of add to that the sort of cultural phenomenon and cult following of Ayn Rand, and you have what we have today, which I believe is a society that has lost its way in terms of our collective sense of who we are as Americans. We have abandoned our founding fathers' ideas of the public square and a commitment, a collective commitment to each other and to our country in favor of this sort of individualist idea of each of us operating, in our own sort of boat, and not understanding that if my boat is a yacht, and you're fishing, out of a barrel. That we are in the same harbor, and ultimately our futures, our destinies are intertwined. We have lost that sense of interdependency, and I think that is among the things that I despair most about in this country today.
And that takes me to thinking about labor, right? So we all are engaged in the economy in one way or another. We're participants. How should I and people think about that engagement? How should we think about the ultimate use of our labor in the system that exists today?
Well, I think there's no doubt that we each have a role to play. The challenge is we have system failure, and we have structures that have been designed to actually get us what we've got. I mean, there is no the inequality that we see today didn't just happen by osmosis. It was designed. Our systems in our economy, our systems in our regulatory sphere were designed. Uh, and if you look at our criminal justice system, it was designed to incarcerate more Black and brown and poor white Americans. We're getting the outcome that it was designed to deliver. And in order to really address this, it's going to take a lot, because the very system that I am calling out in many ways has worked for people like me. Right? And that's what's so difficult, because it is hard for those of us who have been successful in America to uh, grapple with and really confront the aspects of our society and our systems that are fundamentally unfair, that are fundamentally unjust, because it's worked for us. I mean, there is something fundamentally problematic for me 2 years into a pandemic to experience and to observe what has happened to so many Americans. The numbers of people who would simply, without government intervention, have been evicted to the streets. The number of people who have fallen behind when most of us, certainly those of us who own real estate, own second homes, have been able to invest in the equity markets, we are so much better off 2 years into a pandemic.
Mm.
There is something fundamentally problematic that ought to encourage us to interrogate our systems. And I'm not saying that we should feel bad or that we should, but when we are gaining so much in a time of such despair and loss for so many, I do think that it's really incumbent upon those of us who are privileged to do some hard work. And that's really hard because the whole point of privilege is to insulate us who are privileged from the realities, the vicissitudes that regular working class people who are living in public housing, living in rural communities have to deal with and grapple on a daily basis. We're exempt from that because we've got privilege. We should look at that privilege and ask ourselves, what are we doing with it? Are we hoarding it? Uh, and maybe the question for us isn't, what do I give back? Perhaps it's, what do I give up in order to ensure that we do live in a more fair society where there is more justice and opportunity for more of our fellow citizens?
Yeah, that's a big call. So I guess I wanna talk a little bit more about that. So I think there's a verse that goes something like, "It's easier for a rich man to get, or easy for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven." So you're talking about privilege, and we're all engaged in this system, this capitalist system that right now is, I think the way you're describing it, I would call it immoral, right? You have a system where people are suffering and other people are benefiting as a function of the same system. So for the people that are benefiting, how should they think about engagement with that system? Like, you're suggesting they continue to participate and interrogate it. What does that look like? What does it look like for me, someone who's doing really well, to interrogate the system that I participate in, given what I would call, based on your description, it's deep immorality?
Well, I think we have to uh, engage in it in a way that looks at the distribution of benefit of the system and try to understand why it's so skewed. Uh, and I know that many academics and researchers and others have generated data to indicate why people with uh, with advanced degrees, with particular credentials are so valued in the economy, why those who don't have credentials, have basic education, are not valued. And but we have to also look at the very systems, right? So let's look at labor. Uh, At the bottom of the scale, we have people who are vulnerable, who are exploited. If we look at so many in the service industry who work in a tipped system, in a two-tiered minimum wage system, a minimum wage for regular workers and a tipped minimum wage if you work in restaurants or you work in particular industries. Um, that system is rooted going back to slavery, indeed, and that we still persist with the duality of just that sliver of the low wage economy. To my mind, is deeply flawed. Um, so we have to ask ourselves, what are the people who are in our own organizations, in our own systems, who are the lowest paid? What are they paid? Do they uh, have a wage, a compensation that allows them to live with some modicum of dignity? And so, I mean, they're to me just fundamental questions like that. Um, is it always, if you're a director of a public company, uh, does uh, does the imperative of squeezing every dollar out of the balance sheet for share buybacks, does that give you sufficient capital for the capex and the opex investments that you need to make in order for people, employees, to be paid well, for the company to be investing in the right investments to ensure future sustainability? Are we doing those? So those of us who sit in these places and spaces have to be making those kinds of inquiries, and not just simply um, presuming that past practice is what we should continue to adhere to.
Yeah, it's that's thinking about work as so have the social obligation associated with a privileged position in work. And so if we step away from that for just a second and say like how the average person is generally not thinking that way about their job, right? They're figuring out how do I have a good life? How do I do more for my kids or do more for myself? Like, is that not the way people should be thinking about work? Are you suggesting something else? When people go to work, why are they going? What are they going to work for?
Well, first we have to put ourselves in the place of most workers. So you and I are not typical of
Mhm.
most workers. I don't think of my work as uh, as providing me with basic dignity. Uh, I think for a lot of people, yes, um, the way you eloquently described uh, what people want from their work is right in terms of some economic security, in some sense. But what people really want, uh, especially when you talk to low wage workers and service sector workers and people who are working in those $10 an hour jobs. And yes, because of the labor challenges now, we're seeing upticks in those hourly wages. But for a lot of those people, um, they just want to live with dignity. There is nothing um, more horrific and more uh, dehumanizing than not being able to pay your rent, than working 40 hours, 50 hours, 60 hours a week and still being poor. That to me is where my head is, right? I mean, those workers who want to be able to say, if I'm going to work this hard, I ought to not have to live with the indignity of not being able to pay my rent or my car note or the basic necessities for my family without depending on an EBT card, government subsidy, philanthropy, a food bank, the ways in which people make ends meet. And so for me, I think about it as dignity. I believe every person deserves to live with dignity. And the way our economy has marginalized far too many people leaves them without that option.
Hmm. And what's the role of philanthropy here? So you work at a major, one of the biggest philanthropic organizations in the country. What's the role of philanthropy in addressing this? Because you've already noted that it's not the role is not to deal with issues that are really policy issues, governmental policy issues. So what should the role be?
Well, the role of philanthropy can be to support organizations who are helping us understand uh, the consequences of policy, helping us uh, put into policy proposals, into research and data, information that reflects the experience of most Americans. I started my foundation career at the Rockefeller Foundation, and John D. Rockefeller was inspired in part by Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie in 1889 wrote the seminal Gospel of Wealth essay that has inspired philanthropists from Rockefeller through Gates. And he talked about charity and generosity and ensuring that he gave away most of his wealth before he died. But I was inspired by um, a rather obscure uh, uh, set of statements made by Dr. Martin Luther King in 1968, shortly before he died, which were really surprisingly never covered or published. And what he said about philanthropy uh, is the following: philanthropy is commendable, but it should not allow the philanthropist to overlook the economic injustice which makes philanthropy necessary. And so what Dr. King was saying was something different than Carnegie and Rockefeller said. What he was saying was, yes, charity and generosity matter, but dignity and justice should be the calling of philanthropy. And that's a different framework. That's a different understanding of the imperative of philanthropy. And that's a different um, position that the philanthropist puts herself in. The philanthropist, in this case, has to get uncomfortable. The philanthropist doesn't just feel good about themselves and say, I've done a good deed by giving money to this homeless shelter, which is very important and is commendable. But what Dr. King says is the philanthropist ought to go beyond that and ask himself, why is there so much homelessness in one of the richest countries in the world? How can you have in cities from New York to San Francisco to LA to places in middle America, people on the streets living in absolute destitution? Why does that exist in America?
Hmm.
To my mind, that question is a question that philanthropy writ large. Why is it we have a system that we know over incarcerates Black and brown people and poor white people? Why does that system exist, and how do we take corrective action so that we don't have the outcomes that this system was designed? What would a redesign of this system look like to ensure public safety and security, but fairness and justice? So those questions, I believe, not necessarily all of philanthropy. I'm not asserting um, an ideology. I am saying, though, that some of us in philanthropy need to be engaged in that kind of inquisition of our work and of our country and the world, indeed.
Mhm. And that points to an inherent tension in philanthropy that I think that's captured in Dr. Martin Luther King's quote, which is that philanthropy exists in part because of the vast inequities, right? So you have the people like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies who had incredible wealth, where other people were really suffering with basic necessities. How do you square the existence of philanthropy? In part, it's driven by inequities in the capitalist system with the goals of managing those inequities. How do you think about that tension?
Yeah, there's no doubt that that tension is real. And in Carnegie and Rockefeller's day, inequality was assumed to be simply a natural phenomenon. And the fact that in Andrew Carnegie's steel mills, young children were working and falling into tar pits and um, losing limbs, and all the things that happened, and at Standard Oil, entire towns are being blown up and hundreds of people killed. Um, while it was regrettable, it was just the cost of doing business. And inequality was simply the result of the fact that men like Carnegie and Rockefeller saw themselves as having special qualities and God given capability that made it possible for them to amass great wealth, and that there really wasn't anything wrong with the system, and that their job was to give back. I think in 2022, we cannot accept that idea, that philosophy. Um, we can't be uh, of the belief that those of us who have been successful have some special talent that exempts us from having to engage in some of these really fundamental issues of fairness and justice. And so, what it means, and this is the really hard part, Brian, what it means is that uh, we who are most comfortable have to really engage in some uncomfortable acts, holding the mirror up uh, to our society and to those of us who are privileged and asking, you know, uh, does the system just simply compound our privilege? And I think the answer is yes. Everything from our uh, tax system to admissions to elite universities for our children, educational systems, um, etc., uh, are designed to compound the privilege. Uh, if you went to a prestigious private school, um, it is more likely that your child will go. Again, this is an anecdote. We know the data. Uh, if you are a legacy, uh, you are statistically more likely to be admitted. What in a democracy does the fact that your parent went to a university have anything to do with your admissibility, your suitability for admission? Why is it even uh, an indicator uh, in any way? And yet it is. And many people of all political ilks are committed to that system. And to me, that is a small but important variable when I talk about let's interrogate and get uncomfortable. And I do this with some of my very progressive friends in New York City who are graduates of Ivy League schools or of some of the elite boarding schools or day schools in New York City, where their children are privileged over others to be admitted. And it's very hard to get people to say, I think we should end that system. I'm delighted when you see a school like Amherst College, which recently ended legacy admissions. I'm delighted to see that because I think it means that there is more possibility for more aspiring young people to have those opportunities.
So it sounds to me like you're puncturing the myth of meritocracy, as they say here. I have one more question for you. This is the one I ask everyone at the end. How would you reimagine work? And so for you, I'd say all along the pay scale. So the people who are the comfortable people who are privileged enough to do work in a way that really benefits them and allows them to insulate themselves from some of the depredations of capitalism, down to the people who are really trying to scrape together a living. So, how do we think about reimagining work along the pay scale? And what are the implications of that for philanthropy?
Well, I think, for those of us who uh, get to have a conversation about whether and when and how we return to work, uh, many are engaged in this conversation about what is the future of work. Um, just being able to engage in that is a privilege and speaks to uh, the differentiation in our economy and in our labor force, because millions of people don't get to engage in that conversation. They don't get to engage in how many days a week do I want to come back to the office. The drive is too long for me, so can we have some exception? All of the kinds of ways in which uh, work is being redesigned and reestablished, reimagined, they're exempt from that because they've got to come to work every day. They've got to do the deliveries. They've got to work in the retail stores, in the distribution centers, all the things that millions of Americans. And so my hope is that we can engage in a conversation in the boardroom, in the C-suites, in the highest levels of the labor sectors, and ask ourselves, is our system fair? Um, and if it's not, or if we don't know, how do we think about addressing it? How do we understand whether or not it's fair? Uh, and how do we get under the hood, if you will, to really take a sobered analysis from the lens of inequality, of the entire way in which our economy and our own firm may be organized. In my case, what that really meant for us several years ago was recognizing that we had employees of the Ford Foundation who were paid sub minimum wage work. I mean, wages, and the work that had to be done was to really understand what it would take and to do the analysis to ensure that we would going forward pay people so that they could live with dignity in a high cost city like New York. And that was not an easy exercise. And the work still continues, but at least to be able to take a step back, get the data, understand the analysis, and then be able to execute on a plan to ensure more fairness in the future. I just think that that's really an incredibly important thing to do at the very top of every organization today.
Well, I really appreciate that. And also, I appreciate the time you took to talk to me today. And thank you so much for the work you're doing to try to address some of these really important issues.
Thank you, Brian. Been a huge honor to be a part of this. Thank you.
Thanks. So this is the last week of our Reimagining Work series. I really appreciate everyone that joined the conversation. My podcast, Know What You See, is available right now. And starting in January, we will cover Reimagining Work in its second season. So you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We will resume the video series, the webinar in the winter quarter next academic year, so January 2023. And our theme will be People and Planet in the Information Age. I hope to see you there. Thanks.